Hello everyone, I'm Craig Boswell. Today on Interview 360, how the precise calculation of time keeps all of our electronic devices functioning properly. That time is carefully measured and maintained at the U.S. Naval Observatory here in Washington, D.C. At that same location, scientists navigate interplanetary spacecraft. There is also a working observatory with one of the oldest and largest refracting telescopes in the country, and it also happens to be the official residence of the Vice President of the United States. Here to help us understand how all of this is happening in one place is Geoff Chester, Public Affairs Officer at the U.S. Naval Observatory here in Washington. Good to see you again.
Thanks for inviting me.
With the technology that we have today, what would happen if you guys did not keep the precise time?
If we lose precise time synchronization, most of the things that we now take for granted will stop working. So when you do something as simple as go to the ATM to get money from your bank, that won't work. If you swipe a credit card to buy something, that won't work. If you go on the internet to buy something, that won't work. If you talk on your cell phone, that won't work. And most importantly, if you need to get to grandma's house and you rely on that global positioning system box on the dashboard of your car, that won't work.
Okay, so that's me, because I'm Google Maps all the time. So dependent on Google Maps, so it stops functioning.
Basically, anything that has to do with the transfer of digital data from one point to another will be severely compromised. And today, we live, breathe digital data. That is what powers society across the globe today. There is this new thing they call the Internet of Things. You know, everything from a Roomba driving around and cleaning your carpets to who knows what. It is all enabled by precise time and the dissemination of precise time.
So how is that time calculated first, and then how is it kept? Because that's what you guys do.
Right. Well, the Naval Observatory, let's just give a little bit of history here. The Naval Observatory was established on December 6th of the year 1830. The reason that we were established was that the Navy wanted to have a single master time scale that they could use to determine the ticking rates of all the chronometers that they had. In the old days, we used the reference time scale that was used to calibrate clocks was the time scale that was determined by the mean rotation rate of the Earth on its axis. And the only way that you can measure that is astronomically, using a specialized kind of telescope called a transit instrument, which means you have to build an observatory if you want to really get an idea of what time it is. So that's how we came into being.
It's a famous observatory. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, refracting telescopes still operating, continuously operating in the world, right?
Yeah. We have our venerable 26-inch Great Equatorial Telescope is still the 10th largest refractor in the world. It's been operating continuously as a research instrument up here on Mass Ave since 1893, when it was moved up from our original site down in Foggy Bottom. While it was down in Foggy Bottom in 1877, that was the telescope that discovered the moons of Mars.
Right, it is a stunning view. So the pictures are beautiful.
Yeah, it's a pretty neat old instrument.
And you still have a 12-inch refracting.
We have a 12-inch, much newer. That was put into commission in 1895.
Much newer.
Much newer, yes. Now, the measurement of time is the function of this device that we call a clock. And a clock consists of two components. One is an oscillator, something that gives you a periodic variation, and a counter. And you count however many oscillations it takes to produce this time interval that we call the second. Now, as technology evolved, it was discovered back in the early 20th century that you could take an electrical current and pass it through a quartz crystal, and that crystal will oscillate. And if you can make the crystal really, really small, you can get it to oscillate really, really fast. Today, we have something that's even better, and that is what we call the atomic clock. It's analogous to getting a bell to ring without touching it. And the way you do that is you lock yourself in a room with the bell, and if you have perfect pitch, you shout at the bell. When you hit the resonant frequency, the bell oscillates and rings sympathetically. So today, for modern atomic clock technology, we take a certain type of atom and we shine microwaves on it. And when we shine just the right frequency of microwave radiation, an electron in that atom will go into oscillation between what we call hyperfine states. Now, because electrons are really small, you can get them to move really, really fast. So electrons can oscillate at frequencies which are measured in billions of cycles per second. And right now, that is kind of the state of the technology.
So we're talking about the oscillations of atoms bombarded by microwaves. So we've now defined then what a second is, right?
Yes.
So we know.
In terms of that.
And
yes.
You probably already know what that is.
Yeah.
Oh.
You want to know what it is, too,
I want to know if you know this by heart, right?
I do. But to give you an idea of how this has evolved, up until 1967, we were still using the Earth as the reference to determine the second. But the Earth doesn't rotate constantly.
Right, the Earth wobbles in its rotation.
The Earth wobbles in its rotation, and the Earth's orbit around the Sun varies with timescales on approaching tens of thousands of years, which for you and me doesn't make that much difference. But if you are an astrophysicist and you want to know what the solar system is going to look like 10,000 years from now, big problem.
So how have we defined then 1 second?
So in 1967, the world's physicists adopted a new definition of the second, which is the interval of 9,192,631,770 hyperfine transitions of a neutral cesium-133 atom.
You know this.
I know this.
We've come a long way from when we were kids, right?
When it was 1 Mississippi.
Exactly,
That's
on the playground. 1
Yep.
Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, that's how we counted a second.
So that is basically what an atomic clock does.
Being at the observatory, it's also the home of the Vice President's residence. So I'm assuming that you host Vice Presidents and their guests and bring them to the observatory.
That's true. I should point out that the Vice President's residence was built originally as the residence for the observatory superintendent. The first vice president to actually live there was Walter Mondale, and we've hosted everyone since then.
Which vice presidents would remember you most?
I would say probably Vice President Gore and Vice President Biden.
Why?
Vice President Gore, he's very interested in science. So he would come up very often with dinner guests and look through the telescope and so on. There was one night when he happened to be bringing up then Governor Angus King of Maine. You know, things like the International Space Station go by all the time. They're very predictable. But there's a certain type of satellite called an iridium satellite. One of the things that's characteristic after these satellites get into orbit is they maintain a very rigid orientation to the Earth, which means that there are certain times when the sun will glint off a panel on the satellite.
And you guys know this because you've calculated this.
And it makes a very bright flash of light in the sky that, you know, fades up and fades down fairly quickly. And they can be very bright, sometimes 20 times the apparent brightness of Venus, the second brightest objects in the sky, or the brightest objects after the sun and the moon. But these very bright flares, as we call them, only occur over very narrow paths along the suborbital trajectory of the satellite, but we can calculate when and where they're going to happen. It so happened that the evening that Vice President Gore brought Governor King up, one of these was taking place. So as they were coming up the driveway from the residence, I had to pause for a minute, and I pointed at the sky and I said, "I will produce a bright light in the sky in 3, 2, 1, now." And poof, it appeared.
Lo and behold,
Lo and behold, it appeared. So naturally, I was very pleased. Thank you, Motorola.
And Al Gore was very impressed.
And he was very impressed, and he asked me how I did that. And I said to him that I explained to him about iridium satellites and everything. And he then turned to Governor King and he said, "You know, I made the first call on an iridium phone." And Angus King turned around, perfectly straight-faced, and said, "Was that before or after you invented the internet?"
Oh, and that conversation just took, it was
so we had
a
great night after that, yes, indeed.
And you guys were on it.
Yeah, oh yeah, we had a lot of fun. So
you mentioned Joe Biden as well.
Joe Biden, yes. Joe Biden was, so there was one Christmas several years ago they had a group of kids from a school on a military base and a group of kids from a DC public school. And they were up and they make cookies and create Christmas cards to send to the troops overseas and that sort of thing. And I got a phone call from one of the people at the residence saying that they'd kind of run out of things to do. And they still had an hour to kill, and they had all these rambunctious kids running around.
Right, kids are wanting to do things.
So I said, you know, so they said, is there anything you can do? And I said, bring them up and I'll show them the big telescope. Now, I don't want to let the secret out, but, you know, but the big telescope, the 26-inch telescope, is in a dome where the whole floor goes up and down.
Essentially a very large elevator.
It's the largest elevator in Washington, okay? So they come up, and I see this gaggle of kids coming up, and Dr. Biden and the staffers and everybody, and running around in this mix is Champ. At that time,
the dog,
1-year-old German Shepherd puppy that was Vice President Biden's pride and joy. And so we're getting people into the observatory, and we had just had the wooden floor finished, so it was nice and freshly polished and everything. And I said, the dog, probably, you shouldn't bring the dog in here, but, you know, dogs, kids, the dog wound up inside the dome. And of course, everybody's running around. And the dog was chasing a young man who stopped in his sneaks on a dime right in front of an access hole that goes down through the floor to the basement. And the dog attempted to perform the same maneuver, but being on 4 dog feet on a freshly polished wooden floor, it didn't work. So the last vision that I have, and this still plays in my mind. I wake up at night sometimes
vividly,
and this plays it out. Is the image of this dog disappearing hind first down this hole in the floor, and it's an 8-foot drop to the basement, which is a concrete floor. So I thought, oh my God, I have killed the Vice President's dog.
Right. This is not just any dog, which
was
bad enough.
Dog.
Okay,
Right.
this is the Vice President's dog.
It's the Vice President's dog. Well, fortunately, the story has a happy ending because the dog was completely unfazed and went bounding out and chasing deer and whatever. And at least I didn't have to worry about the dog anymore. But a couple of weeks later, the Vice President always has holiday reception for various military staff, that sort of thing. And I was invited to this particular reception, and part of the drill is you get your picture taken with the Vice President. And as I was being brought into the room where the picture was being taken, the usher takes my little card and says, Geoffrey Chester, and the Vice President goes, oh, I know Jeff. He's the guy who almost killed my dog.
Instant recognition.
So, instant recognition, which, you know, good or bad, but the reputation followed. The good news is that about a year after that, the Vice President was up at the observatory filming a public service announcement. And Champ came up with him. And Champ settled down over in a corner in the library, and Champ and I sat down and we had a nice conversation. So Champ and I are good now.
You guys bonded at that point.
Yeah.
And no dogs were harmed in the telling
No dogs
of the
were
story.
harmed, no,
Yeah.
no.
Years and years and years ago, and older generations will remember this, actually dialing a number to get the precise time.
Yeah.
When you dial the Naval Observatory, you get a voice on the phone that
Right.
tells you exactly what time it is right
Right.
now. Does that still functions?
That still functions, it does. Still the same voice. It is an actor named Fred Covington, and Fred passed away in 1993, but we were able to preserve his voice in digital format so that he is continually telling you what time it is, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
I thought I would have heard a computerized voice, but it is an actor with a very deep
good
voice, a
voice.
very
Yep.
melodic voice. Can we
Yes.
hear that?
U.S. Naval Observatory Master Clock at the tone Eastern Daylight Time. 14 hours, 58 minutes, 30 seconds.
Yeah, for people who call that, if they still do. I
yeah.
did, just to see if
Yeah.
it was still there.
Yeah.
It is still the same voice.
No,
It's-
our voice announcer handles somewhere in the vicinity of 3.5 million calls a year.
This recording we just listened to.
We just listened to, yeah. There are other ways of getting time too, whether you realize it or not. The internet has what's called Network Time Protocol, which or NTP, which is a server-client application. So there's a dedicated port on a server, and you basically send a request to that port saying what time is it, and it will then tell you what time it thinks it will be when the signal gets back to you, because it builds in a delay for the network delays to and from.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you have a wireless modem, which most people
Right.
do, it's doing that then all
Yeah,
the time. So
yeah.
you're
So-
essentially contacting.
Yeah. So if you have a wireless router in your house,
router, yes.
yeah, it will usually ping the NTP server about once an hour or so, just to make sure that everything on your network is keeping time.
Right, so all of us are contacting
Right.
the
Yeah.
observatory
So
at some point or another.
So our NTP servers at the observatory handle about 750 million NTP queries per day.
Per day.
Per day.
Wow,
Somewhere in the vicinity of 3 trillion a year.
insane. Who knew?
If I only had a nickel for each one.
Thank you. If I only had a nickel for every nickel I had.
Yeah, right. Then you could get a nickel cigar and get 2 cents back in your pocket.
That's
But
a great
anyway.
thing. All right, so 21 years at the Naval Observatory, right?
That's right.
Favorite time, favorite moment?
Oh, gosh. There have been many. Nobody thinks about what this kind of information means. Nobody thinks about precise time, but everybody uses it, whether they know it or not. So if I have to sum up what the observatory does in 2 words, it's very simple. We provide what I would call reference frames. So the information that you get from us enables you to know where you are and at what time you're at that location. And after all, going from day-to-day life, you start at a location at a certain time and you know you have to be at another location at another time. So we provide the framework that allows that to happen.
Right.
You know, the best moments again are when I can get that aha moment from someone who's coming through saying, wow, I didn't know you guys did that.
That is extremely rewarding for you.
That's what I do. That's what I'm supposed to do. And if I can get that message across, then I have done my job.
Geoff, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And we thank you for watching. Look forward to seeing you back here next time. This is Interview 360.